choose to go to the moon?
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too. The speaker, John F. Kennedy, delivering his speech as President of the United States in September of 1962. The occasion was to make his case to the American public that it was time for humanity to step foot on the moon, and it was time for the United States to endeavor to be the nation to do it. It was a mission of incredible ambition, done at incredible risk to the astronauts who chose to take part, and done by a union of some of the most celebrated minds of the era. It was Kennedy's moonshot, quite literally, and one that would place the US at the forefront of space exploration for decades to come. It was called the Apollo program, the mission to put a man on the moon and bring him home. The story of the Apollo program is one of groundbreaking space exploration, but it's a story that is impossible to tell without first dealing with a much more terrestrial matter: the Cold War. For those among our viewers who choose to gaze longingly at the stars rather than at the small squabbles of humanity, allow us to paraphrase. Basically, after World War II concluded, both the US and the Soviet Union decided to try and prove that they were the world's dominant superpower. But rather than attack each other and destroy the entire planet with their massive nuclear arsenals, they decided to engage in a sort of hyper-competitive chess match. Alliances with other countries, advancements in technology, building really big or dangerous weapons, and basically anything else the two sides could agree on became targets to try and one-up each other on until one side eventually collapsed under the strain. And for the Soviet Union, one of those areas of competition was space exploration, an area they got a head start in with the launch of humanity's first satellite, Sputnik. Now, Sputnik itself didn't really do very much, but the fact that the Soviets could get it into orbit meant a couple of key things. One, they're better at space than the Americans, and two, that rocket that was just used to launch Sputnik would be really, really scary if, it had a nuclear warhead strapped to it. Just before we continue with the video today, I wanted to take a quick moment to share something that's made a world of difference in my digital life, and that is Surfshark VPN. Imagine this, you're at your favorite cafe, you're busy working on your laptop, but whoa, hold on a minute, public Wi-Fi. Oh my. And that's where Surfshark swoops in, acting like a superhero for your online safety. It's like wearing a digital invisibility cloak. Surfshark masks what you do online, keeping your internet life private and secure. No more worries about prying eyes, but it's not just about privacy, it's about unlocking the world. With Surfshark, you can virtually travel anywhere, connect to a server, and enjoy the biggest Netflix library. Goodbye geo restrictions. Now, I know we all love a good deal. Surfshark not only protects you, but it lets you access blocked websites for those amazing deals, even when you're somewhere else in the world. And the best part, Surfshark Alert, Surfshark Antivirus, and Surfshark Search. You get this security combo all in one subscription. No more worries, Surfshark's got your back. With features like GPS spoofing, bypasser, and multi-op, you're not just browsing, you're browsing smartly. Use the promo code MEGA and you'll get an exclusive deal, 6 additional months for free. That's right, 6 months on the house. Click the link in the description below, or go to surfshark.deals/mega. Stay secure out there, and now back to today's video. The Soviets used advancements like this to gain an early edge in the space race. The global public picked up on the space race and started watching it closely, and the United States, under President Dwight D. Eisenhower, basically pretended that the space race just didn't exist at all. For a while, the US had treated space-related rocketry innovations as strictly a military matter, how to put missiles in orbit before dropping them on Joseph Stalin's head. But the addition of Sputnik and the public perception that it created, that the United States was lagging behind the Soviets, was enough to push the US toward a much more public space exploration arm of its own. Their answer was a civilian agency called the National Aeronautics and Space Agency, better known today as NASA. The birth of NASA came at the right time to solicit strong support from the US Congress, and it began to alleviate the intense public pressure on the US military to start picking up some wins in a space race that they still wouldn't admit existed. But NASA's timing was impeccable for another reason too. They'd be finding their footing at just the same time as President Eisenhower went out and one John F. Kennedy was coming in. From his days on the campaign trail, Kennedy had emphasized his wish to achieve American superiority over the Soviet Union in the field of space exploration, as well as a tightly related field, missile defense. Calling out Eisenhower's inaction on the issue, Kennedy pledged to make aerospace development a priority not just because of its military benefit, but because of the prestige and acclaim that it would lend the United States both at home and on the world stage. But despite the big talk, Kennedy didn't exactly hit the ground running when he took office, at least not on the issue of space exploration. Luckily for him, the good folks over at NASA were already awaiting with a proposal. Drawn up in the waning days of the Eisenhower presidency, NASA's plan for a major victory in space had been given the name Apollo in homage to the Greek god of the sun. Apollo's objective? To be able to ferry groups of 3 astronauts back and forth into space, first to make a space station, then to make flights that would allow them to travel around the moon and eventually land on the lunar surface. Apollo had already been announced as an exploratory program prior to Kennedy taking office, and NASA had drawn up a list of basic hopes and expectations on how a spacecraft might look. By October, a few weeks prior to Kennedy taking office, the US government had awarded contracts to several companies to see who would earn the privilege of partnering with them. When Kennedy arrived and started poring over the plans NASA had sent him, his reaction was initially one of some skepticism. After all, the program would be extremely expensive to pull off, and even if his administration could foot the bill, it would require a depth of technical understanding that Kennedy would have to work up to. To put it simply, he didn't know what he didn't know, and for an incoming president trying to navigate his country through the Cold War, that's a pretty scary proposition. When it came time for Kennedy's administrators at NASA to ask for more funding, Kennedy was hesitant. And when it came time to approve new aspects of the mission, the new president seemed unlikely to take the sort of dramatic leaps that the American public had been hoping for. But well, that all changed on April 12, 1961, when the Soviets did it again. This time it wasn't just a probe that they'd put into space, it was a man, Yuri Gagarin. He orbited the Earth and came home safely. When word reached Washington of Gagarin's feats and of what would undoubtedly be taken as a major Soviet victory for the space race, the Kennedy administration quickly realized that it no longer made sense to simply hope that the space issue would solve itself. Congress offered its immediate support for a crash program, and while Kennedy didn't take him up on that particular offer, he sent his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, to figure out what NASA could do to remedy the situation. The news Johnson brought back was not the news that Kennedy wanted to hear. The Soviets had beaten the Americans twice before in the space race, and they were going to do it again. According to what NASA and other organizations could tell Johnson about the Soviets, they were too far ahead for the United States to pull off a quick reversal. Easier and cheaper milestones like building a space station or flying a probe or even a person around the moon weren't going to be enough to upset the balance as it existed at the time. The Kennedy administration would need to pull off a comeback, the kind that only came after repeated defeats and previously unthinkable levels of investment into a bold solution. By Johnson's estimates, if Kennedy wanted the biggest comeback on the closest timeline and was willing to spend the American taxpayer's dollar in order to get it, then the target was absolutely clear. Americans would have to set foot on the moon, and if they had any hope of getting it done before the Soviets, they would have to start work immediately. Just over a month later, and fresh off the success of the Freedom 7 mission, which took Americans on a crewed spaceflight for the very first time, Kennedy announced his proposal for a moon landing in an address to Congress. In his words, "Now is the time to take longer strides. Time for a new American enterprise. Time for this nation to take a clearly leading role in space achievement, which in many ways may hold the key to our future on Earth. I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth." With a nod to the likely astronomical costs of the program and to the technical difficulties therein, Kennedy made his best pitch to a Congress that had now been waiting to hear it for some time. The countdown clock had begun, and now there was no way to end it except to step an American foot on lunar soil. Kennedy's pledge to the American public was a major opportunity for NASA to lead the way on what would be a defining feat of the 20th century, but it also came with its set of inconveniences, not least of which was that NASA did not actually know how to get to the moon. Granted, they had some ideas, but at the time of Kennedy's speech, that was all they had. As NASA worked it out, the US could get someone to the moon in 3 basic ways. The first way, they could put a single large spacecraft into Earth's orbit, fly it over to the moon, land it on the lunar surface, have it take off again, and fly it home. But this would require rockets that the US didn't have at the time and still didn't expect to have until at least 1970, thus going out beyond Kennedy's deadline to complete their mission by the end of the 60s. In the second option, a spacecraft carrying the Apollo crew would be brought up into the Earth's orbit, where they would dock with a separate propulsion unit which would have been put into orbit by a different launch. But this option required not 1, but 2 launches from Earth, sending costs through the roof. The third option, and the one the US ultimately went with, was to employ a powerful rocket that the USA did expect to have on hand that could fire directly at the moon and place a spacecraft into a lunar trajectory. That spacecraft would have 3 sections: a command module where the astronauts sat, a service module where the fuel and power was stored, and a lunar module attached to the nose of the command module. When the thing reached orbit, 2 of the astronauts would crawl into the lunar module, while the third would remain at the command module. The 2 astronauts in the lunar module would descend to the moon's surface, leave behind the part of the lunar module that was built to manage the descent, and take off from the lunar surface in the ascent part of the module, eventually meeting up with the command and service modules again and returning to Earth. Now, this approach had a few key advantages over the alternatives. It was cheaper, since it only needed 1 rocket, and it could ditch the lunar module in space rather than bring it home, meaning that the entire apparatus needed less fuel to make its journey. It also had the fringe benefit of notching another first for the US space program, since the lunar module, in effect a separate craft, would begin and end its mission in the vacuum of space without ever once touching the atmosphere. Thus, the United States could also lay claim to having conducted the first true spaceflight in history. But settling on a conceptual approach to a spacecraft was just one of about, a million things on NASA's new to-do list, a list that quickly grew so long that many NASA employees were skeptical from the outset that Kennedy's deadline could be met. Not long after Kennedy's address, NASA threw out the feasibility studies it had already commissioned and decided instead to proceed with their internal designs for a module designed by an engineer, Maxime Faget, who had already successfully designed the Mercury spacecraft. North American Aviation, maker of the P-51 Mustang and eventually the B-1 Lancer, was chosen as manufacturing partner, and money poured into the program from all sides. So much money, in fact, that with continued investment, the Apollo program would constitute the largest peacetime resource allocation by a single nation in world history. With money came people, hundreds of thousands of people, and the combined might of American industry and academia was in full force. NASA, previously a humble little space organization in its early days, quickly had to upsize itself to meet demand. The Apollo program moved into a site in Houston, Texas, today known as the Lyndon B. Johnson Space Center, where NASA would heretofore locate all of its human spaceflight training. So too did the site get a mission control center, taking over for Cape Canaveral for the scope of the Apollo missions. The site was completed in 1963, and alongside it, NASA built a pair of launch complexes for Saturn I and 1B rockets. Back in Florida, on Merritt Island, NASA built an even bigger launch site with facilities for a launch vehicle and spacecraft to be assembled on premises and then moved by a slow, gargantuan crawler platform to one of 2 eventual launch pads. But even with all this development, even with all this highly sophisticated preparatory work, American leaders understood that they were still doing the easy part.
Far harder would be figuring out the innumerable technological issues that stood in the way of a safe, survivable mission for NASA's crew.
Politically, their work was made harder by one Jerome Weisner, science advisor to the president, who advocated against the launch vehicle arrangement that NASA had picked out and actively undermined the Apollo mission to exercise his opposition to it. And on a technical level, the already difficult challenge of designing everything from a launch vehicle to a capsule to a lunar lander was made all the worse by the program's time crunch, which meant that every little delay on a single element of the program meant delaying the entire thing. NASA had to figure out how to write software and program it into an onboard guidance computer and a lunar module, something that was groundbreaking at the time, and invent everything from components of the flight suits to components of the modules to components of the rockets that would take the astronauts into space. Now, we'll get to some of the many cool inventions that came from the program later, but for now, we've simply got to stress the immense demands placed on researchers and scientists, both at NASA and its partners in the private industry. By 1963, things were looking pretty grim at NASA, with the American solo mission to the moon seeming more and more difficult by the day, with even JFK himself appearing to have conceded defeat. In September of that year, Kennedy made a forceful appeal to the Soviet Union to combine forces and create a joint lunar program. This address, made before the UN General Assembly less than a year after the Cuban Missile Crisis, just goes to show how dire the situation was back at NASA, and although the Soviets initially rejected the proposal, the son of then Premier Nikita Khrushchev has since explained that the Soviets did consider coming to the negotiating table after the fact. In Congress and across the federal government, critics were closing in on the Apollo program, which by then was looking more and more like a bloated effort to drain American financial resources and less like a program that was destined for success. Kennedy had made previous attempts to cope with the delays by pushing NASA to drop its scientific goals from the Apollo missions and even speed up the timing of a landing, but it was clear to both him and those around him that even if he served 2 terms, man would not land on the moon within his presidency. Anything before 1969 was too optimistic to hold out hope, and in all likelihood, the next person to assume Kennedy's presidency would want to score major political points by cancelling the project, no matter how far along it was. But everything changed in the US. Just 2 months after Kennedy's appeal to the Soviet Union at the UN. Just after noon on November 22nd, 1963, John F. Kennedy was assassinated in downtown Dallas, Texas. In the wake of Kennedy's death, Lyndon Johnson would assume the presidency, and Johnson, a long proponent of the Apollo missions even while Kennedy had been alive, adopted the mission as a sort of national tribute to Kennedy's legacy. Cape Canaveral was renamed Cape Kennedy, and the program's value to the American consciousness increased exponentially. In his first budget proposal to Congress, Johnson would slash funding for defense, agriculture, and more, but he allocated more money to NASA than ever before, and Congress, presiding over a nation still in shock over its former president's assassination, decided to agree. Thus, it was in a tragic twist of fate that Kennedy's own death shielded his Apollo program from future political opposition and recommitted a once skeptical American public to the dream of landing a man on the moon. The mid-1960s was something of a renaissance for American aerospace design, and the demands of the Apollo program forced a level of collaborative innovation that hadn't been seen since the later years of World War II. The Apollo spacecraft, the launch vehicles, and the lunar modules all had to be designed from the ground up, drawing on new technologies and yet unexplored theories of space travel in order to function. First, there was the Apollo spacecraft itself, based on that lunar orbit rendezvous approach that we spoke about earlier. Launch a rocket at the moon, drop a spacecraft on trajectory to reach it, and from that spacecraft send down a lunar module that can land and return before the mission's astronauts set a course back home. On the nose of the spacecraft was its command module, a conical design that was just big enough to sit 3 astronauts in their flight suits. With a dry weight of about 11,000 pounds and powered by 12 reaction control motors, the command module had to be designed to complete part of the flight by itself, because it was the only part of the spacecraft that was going to return to Earth. The module included a pressurized cabin where astronauts could take off their helmets or the rest of their gear if need be, along with the instrument panel that the astronauts would use to fly their spacecraft. It came with guidance and navigational systems, a communications array, batteries to power itself, and a computer that could help fill some of the module's tasks autonomously. It came with 5 windows, a docking hatch, a side hatch, and enough room to store the food and water that would sustain the astronauts on their flight. For purposes of atmospheric re-entry, the module was equipped with a heat shield, as well as parachutes to slow it down so that it wouldn't go crashing into the Earth when it returned. Behind the command module was the service module, an unpressurized compartment that housed its own propulsion engine. This engine would do the bulk of the work in getting the Apollo spacecraft in and out of lunar orbit, and with a thrust of 22,000 pounds on the main engines and a series of 16 reaction control motors to keep it on course, the thing was more than able to do the job. From the front of the module, where it docked with the command module, to the rear edge of its engine, it measured some 22.5 feet, just large enough to hold its fuel cells, its radiators, its oxygen stores, and its directional antenna. Critically, the engine was built to restart, meaning that it could be brought into lunar orbit and shut down in order to conserve fuel. The service module would stay with the command module until just before the command module hit Earth's atmosphere, where it would be jettisoned and left to fall into the atmosphere at its own pace. And finally, there was the lunar module, a separate vehicle that was unlike anything humans had ever designed before. Built Built in a spider-like design, complete with what we'll colloquially describe as a head, abdomen, and a few legs, the lunar module was built with sustained operation in mind. That is to say, one where astronauts would be parking it on the lunar surface and using it to remain in contact with NASA for the duration of their work before lifting off. As we mentioned previously, it was built with a descent stage, which would be left on the lunar surface, and an ascent stage, which would ascend. It's all there in the naming, isn't it? The descent stage came equipped with landing gear, radar to map the lunar surface before it touched down, a propulsion system designed to both get it to the moon and fire in reverse to make sure that the thing didn't crash, and just enough fuel to safely make the landing. It included several cargo compartments with room for all of NASA's lunar experiments, a television camera to see the surface, boxes for sample collection, and the requisite tools for the astronauts to find their way around and perform their work. In the ascent stage, NASA included all of the things that the astronauts would need on their way back. A crew cabin, instrument panels, a port they could use to dock with the command capsule, guidance systems, radar communications, and just enough fuel to power a second rocket engine, which would get the ascent craft back into the right trajectory to rendezvous with the command capsule. The entire three-part spacecraft, the lander, the command module, and the service module, were connected with the spacecraft lunar module adapter, a conical structure that held the lunar module inside. On its narrower top end, it connected to the base of the service module, while on the fatter bottom end, it connected to the rest of the rocket that would take it into space, which we'll be talking about in just a moment. The adapter was built to open outward in a sort of flower petal design once the whole apparatus had reached the vacuum of space, where things like the awkward design of the lunar lander wouldn't create drag because, put simply, there's nothing for it to drag on. The adapter was built to be less than 2 inches thick, covered by a coat of cork and paint to prevent it from overheating, and it was intended to be controlled by the astronauts in the command capsule, who could tell it when to separate. In case those controls failed, the adapter was fitted with explosive charges and detonators that would separate it by force, and for good reason. Failure to do so would leave the crew stranded in Earth's orbit with nobody coming to the rescue. And lastly, there was the launch escape system, a smaller rocket placed directly on top of the command capsule. In the event of an emergency, the launch escape system was intended to jettison itself and the command capsule away from the rest of the launch by force. It could be triggered manually by the crew inside, and it featured a tripwire system that would trigger a launch automatically in case something went wrong on the rest of the launch vehicle. Once that happened, the rocket would carry the crew capsule upward before veering off in another direction, thus getting it out of the way of the much larger and potentially exploding rocket behind it. From there, the command capsule would deploy its parachutes and the whole apparatus would be escorted gently back to the ground. In the event that it wasn't needed, the launch escape system would jettison itself roughly 20 to 30 seconds after the launch vehicle's second stage rocket boosters ignited. Thankfully for all involved, the launch escape system never had to be used. After the spacecraft itself came the launch vehicles, which had been planned for some time by the rocket engineering teams of Wernher von Braun. The rocket used for early flight testing was a stubby little thing named Little Joe 2, basically a single booster rocket that NASA could plop their spacecraft onto at a total height of some 88 feet. But the real work was done by the Saturn series of rockets, including their inaugural member, Saturn I. A liquid-burning, two-stage rocket that could produce some ludicrous amounts of thrust, Saturn I was the main workhorse for NASA's testing stages, but gave up its duties to the somewhat larger and significantly more powerful Saturn IB, and eventually launch responsibilities were handed over to Saturn V, a 363-foot-tall behemoth that launched in 3 stages and produced some truly unprecedented thrust. And finally, there was the most crucial piece of all, the astronauts assigned to the Apollo mission. Numbering 32 in total, 3/4 of the group would eventually get to visit space, and half would walk on the surface of the moon. Although we don't have quite enough time to run through 32 individual biographies, we'll at least shout out some of the most famous. Neil Armstrong was a Navy aviator and a test pilot for experimental aircraft, who had already led a successful mission to perform the first docking of a spacecraft in orbit. Buzz Aldrin was an Air Force pilot who joined NASA 3 years into the program, and who had been a critical member of the team to experiment with procedures for spacewalks. Michael Collins was an experimental test flight officer with the Air Force, and would eventually become a brigadier general there, while with NASA he'd serve on several manned space missions. Charles Pete Conrad was a veteran of space travel by the time he went up with the Apollo program, and Alan Shepard had already made world news as the first American in space in 1961, and he made waves in NASA as the chief of the astronaut office. Charles Duke was a retired brigadier general in the Air Force, and Eugene Cernan was a Navy man who had taken his first trip to space on Gemini 9. Together, these 32 future spacemen underwent training at both NASA's own facilities and in parts of the American Southwest and the wider world that geologically and visually resembled the surface of the moon. The astronauts were trained with a strong priority on muscle memory in order to ensure that they could fluidly move through their practices on the lunar surface and maximize the short time available to them, so a large part of the training was essentially manual labor, practicing collection and analysis of samples, selecting locations to sample, digging trenches, taking soil cores, photographing, and generally getting their labeling practices down to a T. Some of the locations they used to practice have been blasted out into craters and coated with materials that mirrored the lunar surface, while others were major geological zones of interest, like the Grand Canyon. They practiced maneuvering their lunar lander in a special simulator that used upward-facing turbofans to mimic the moon's gravity, and they were taught to walk, run, and jump in their new gravitational environment while wearing their heavy spacesuits. Although they lacked the sophisticated training tools that an astronaut would have today, NASA took every possible measure to ensure that their boys would be equipped to go to space, and well-equipped they certainly were. When it finally came time for the Apollo program's first spaceflight, 3 intrepid explorers were chosen for the mission: Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. 2 were spaceflight veterans. All 3 had made their mark at NASA in their own way, and together they'd perform a low-Earth orbital test of the Apollo command and service modules. But their mission and the program itself was struck with tragedy. In a launch rehearsal test less than a month prior to their expected mission date, a cabin fire broke out inside the command module and took the lives of all 3 astronauts. An electrical issue had caused sparks to fly, which then caught and spread on the nylon material used inside the command module, and was made far worse by the cabin's atmosphere, which was highly saturated with oxygen and a high overall pressure. Even worse, the astronauts couldn't be saved in time, in part because they were sealed in by that same pressure. During the test, fuel hadn't been put into the rocket below, so there had been little expectation of any risk of emergency, and as a result, NASA staff on the grounds were not ready or able to respond in time. It took 5 minutes to open the capsule, by which time all 3 men were already dead. The accident prompted major political fallout across the United States, so bad that it risked ending the entire Apollo program, an end that very well could have come to pass if Lyndon Johnson hadn't lent his personal support to the continuation of the project. Inside NASA, the 3 astronauts' deaths prompted a reckoning about how quickly and easily the Apollo program's teams had started looking past safety issues and small details and brought about a new cultural expectation of its mission control team: to be tough and competent and settle for nothing less than perfection. The accident prompted major redesigns of the command capsule and the spacesuits for future astronauts, and it also prompted a name change. The crewed mission these 3 astronauts were prepping for was originally designated as a test flight, Apollo Saturn 204, but now it would be immortalized by a different name: Apollo 1. The name that the crew themselves had intended on using when their moment arrived to go to space. The next numbered Apollo flight was Apollo 4, as a result of an announcement by NASA's Associate Director of Manned Spaceflight, Dr. George Mueller. Delayed after first being scheduled for November of 1967, Apollo 4 was an uncrewed mission intended to allow the Apollo team to practice putting their craft into Earth's orbit and re-enter the atmosphere safely before eventually splashing down in the Pacific Ocean. The test was the first flight of the gargantuan Saturn V rocket and a critical test for the command and service modules too. Apollo 4's flight was a success. The spacecraft eventually reached an altitude of 11,000 miles from the Earth's surface and completed an 8.5-hour flight that took it around the world twice. Once those 2 laps were completed, Apollo 4 re-entered the atmosphere at a speed of nearly 25,000 miles per hour, with the resulting dive toward the Earth's surface, proving that the spacecraft's heat shield was ready to be entrusted with the lives of its astronauts. Funnily enough, Apollo 4 was the first rocket test of NASA's history where every single rocket stage and every part of the spacecraft demonstrated perfect functionality, indicating just how much of an impact the Apollo 1 disaster had had on ensuring NASA's higher standards for the future. Apollo 5 was similarly successful, testing the lunar module's ascent and descent stages, despite a couple of unexpected hiccups. Finally, Apollo 6 finished the mission's run of unmanned flights, and though the mission was plagued by engine failures on the Saturn V launch vehicle, the rocket was still able to hit the right benchmarks and prove that it was capable, at least in theory, of taking the capsule into a lunar trajectory. And finally, it came time for the big day. Apollo 7, the first spaceflight of the program that would take astronauts to space. Manned by Walter Schirra, Don Eisel, and R. Walter Cunningham, the mission was deemed so important that, as Eisel had said, coming on the heels of the fire, we knew the fate and future of the entire manned space program, let alone our own skins, was riding on the success or failure of Apollo 7. Their objective was to prove habitability of the command module over the full period of time that a lunar mission would take, perform an orbital rendezvous, and then complete a precision re-entry to the Earth's atmosphere. When the spacecraft lifted off on the back of a Saturn 1B rocket, it reached orbit without issue and docked successfully with an orbital target, something it did again soon after in a second test. The astronauts broadcast back to Earth from space while orbiting the planet, a TV appearance that would later earn them a special Emmy Award, and they were able to demonstrate the performance of the redesigned command module, which met expectations in every area. The mission certainly wasn't perfect. It was marked by tensions between the astronauts on board and the technicians at Mission Control, in large part due to Mission Control's willingness to accept risks like taking off in high winds or pushing mission objectives into the astronauts' designated sleep time, when for the astronauts aboard those minor-sounding requests could have easily ended their lives. So too did the crew's television obligations cut into their mission time, and they took umbrage with several of the tests Mission Control had asked for. Finally, the crew spent most of their orbit sick and insisted on splashing back down to Earth with their helmets taken off in order to not burst their eardrums, something that caused intense anger at Mission Control since it was contrary to the expected procedure they'd established beforehand. But regardless, when the crew splashed down after 10 days, 20 hours, 9 minutes, and 3 seconds of flight, their mission was hailed as an unrequited success. Not only was it a critical step in getting to the moon, but it was a turning point in proving to the world that NASA really could pull this whole thing off. The next mission, Apollo 8, would go even further, not touching down on the moon quite yet, but orbiting it for the first time. When it was conceived, Apollo 8 was meant to be a repeat of the Apollo 7 tests, but it was scaled up in its ambition not long after, with the goal being get to the moon, orbit the moon, and come back home from the moon. While on the mission, the Apollo 8 crew took 68 hours to travel to the moon before orbiting it 10 times in 20 hours. During that time, they broadcast back to Earth in what was, when it happened, the most watched television broadcast in history. They catalogued both the moon's surface via photographs and the effects of the moon's gravity on their orbit. The mission, again, wasn't perfect. One astronaut got sick from what's now believed to be space adaptation syndrome, basically a space traveler's version of car sickness, and had the misfortune of leaving vomit and feces floating around the command module as a result. But all of that was quickly made up for when the 3 men aboard became the first in human history to see the moon up close and personal. They were also the first to witness an Earthrise, as the Earth appeared over the moon's horizon like the sun does on Earth. 89.5 hours into their flight, Apollo 8 successfully set a course to Earth, and the mission, yet again, was declared a success. Apollos 9 and 10 would achieve similar success on their own mission objectives. Apollo 9 was done in low Earth orbit, testing out the lunar module to qualify it for its lunar operations. The module performed its descent and ascent procedures under crew control in space, rendezvoused with the command module, and demonstrated the use of its portable life support backpack outside the cabin. The mission was deemed a complete success, and so was its successor Apollo 10. This time, the goal was to essentially do a dress rehearsal for the moon landing, getting into lunar orbit, testing all spacecraft components and mechanisms, and doing everything short of actually setting down on the moon. In this mission, the lunar module came within 8 miles of the lunar surface, barely higher than a commercial jet would fly over the Earth today. Despite some problems, the mission was yet again declared a success, and it also set a speed record for any crewed man-made vehicle, 24,791 miles per hour, achieved on the flight home. At long last, the moment of truth finally arrived, the Apollo 11 mission, when the United States would finally achieve the goal Kennedy had set out nearly a decade ago, and put a capstone on what would be an incredible victory in the space race. Man was going to step foot on the moon. The crew on board, you likely already know, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, joined by the man who would pilot the command module in lunar orbit, Michael Collins. The mission had been meticulously planned, with every minute detail and every inch of lunar territory mapped out, and it captured the world's attention by the time it began, with a full 1 million spectators picking spots to camp out within the launch site's visual range. The 3 astronauts had a long list of tasks to complete, not just land on the lunar surface, but to deploy a range of experiments, gather lunar samples, take extensive photographs of the lunar surface, and set up a television camera that could beam signals back to Earth.
Mission launch came on July the 16th, 1969, and over 3 days later, the crew began lunar orbit insertion.
After extensive pre-landing checks, Aldrin and Armstrong clambered into the lunar module, dubbed the Eagle, and descended to the lunar surface. 102 hours into the journey, the Eagle landed in a lunar area dubbed the Sea of Tranquility. And about 4 hours later, Neil Armstrong stepped out onto the surface of the moon. Now, we know you know what he said, dear viewer, but we'll say it again.
It's one small step for man, one
Aldrin's addition when he exited the lander a few minutes later is lesser known.
Magnificent desolation.
After the first few minutes of quiet, awed staring, the two men set to work. They planted an American flag into the lunar soil, took a phone call from then-President Richard Nixon, and learned how to walk in their spacesuits in true 1/6 gravity. They set up experiments, took samples, and did everything else NASA had expected of them, and they left behind a few more things as well. An Apollo 1 mission patch in memory of the 3 astronauts who had perished, 2 memorial medals for Soviet cosmonauts Yuri Gagarin and Vladimir Komarov, and a silicon message disc carrying messages of goodwill from Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, and the leaders of 73 world nations. After their moonwalk concluded, Aldrin and Armstrong took a 7-hour rest, prepped their lander, and descended from the surface of the moon, knocking over their American flag in the process, but it's the thought that counts. The lunar module docked with the command module. Aldrin and Armstrong joined Collins for the trip home, then after splashing down, the 3 of them spent a brief period in quarantine for, moon diseases or something. Eventually, they were granted a clean bill of health and began a world tour that would last, in many ways, for the rest of their lives. In addition to its role as a major cultural turning point in not just American but human history, the Apollo program was ultimately a scientific venture, and like any good scientific study, the next step was replication. Enter Apollo 12, NASA's second trip to the lunar surface, crewed by the future moonwalkers Pete Conrad and Alan Bean, and their man in the command module, Richard Gordon. This journey was a bit more harrowing. Apollo 12 would be struck by lightning twice after blasting off on a rainy day, and although the trip was supposed to feature the moon's first color television camera, that camera was lost mid-mission. But nonetheless, the 3 men aboard proved more than capable of completing their mission, deploying a package of experiments, taking more samples, raising another US flag, and visiting the Surveyor 3 probe, which had landed on the moon years prior. Their mission, like Apollo 11, was a resounding success, and while the prior moon landing had shown that America had functionally won that chapter of the space race, Apollo 12 proved something just as important, that it wasn't just luck, but skill, science, and the badasses over at NASA who had made the whole thing happen. But all those bold claims will be put to the test a few months later in a mission that became NASA's closest brush with catastrophe since Apollo 1. The mission, of course, was Apollo 13, a voyage that was intended to result in NASA's third landing on the moon. Crewed by Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Haise, Apollo 13 was supposed to be a more serious foray into moon geology and an exploration of the Fra Mauro crater, which was believed to contain high volumes of material from both the moon's and Earth's early history. The astronauts were expected to accomplish a full suite of other tasks, building off the work that had already been done and laying the groundwork for potentially more elaborate explorations of the moon later on. But catastrophe struck the mission almost as soon as it began.
Houston, we've had a problem.
After an unexpected engine shutdown on the second stage of the Saturn V rocket Apollo 13 used to get into orbit, the crew were initially able to get themselves back on track, although they had a somewhat less devastating mishap when one man on board, Jack Swigert, realized that he'd forgotten to file his taxes. But that levity quickly evaporated when about 210,000 miles from Earth, the crew heard a loud bang from within the spacecraft. One of the vessel's oxygen tanks had blown up, causing a second one, nested right beside it, to fail too. The explosion knocked out the command module's supply of electricity, light, and water, and 2 of the spacecraft's 3 fuel cells were lost. As the spacecraft vented the last of their precious oxygen into space, the crew sealed themselves off from the lunar module to conserve what they had left. In those few moments, Apollo 13 had ceased to be a mission to the moon, and now the only mission that mattered was finding a way to get back to Earth alive. Mission Control in Houston leapt into action, drawing up completely new procedures and protocols, testing them in their facility simulators as quickly as possible, and doing their best to relay those protocols to the crew once they'd proven reasonably trustworthy. They worked out quickly that the crew would have to come home in the lunar module, firing its descent engine in a precise orientation to use their minimal amounts of fuel and set a course back to Earth. The lunar module's separate oxygen reserves were enough to keep everybody alive, and all non-essential electrical functions were shut down to give the module enough life to perform its task. But the main issue was water cooling, where the module was predicted to run out of water just hours before re-entering the atmosphere. The crew immediately began rationing water with such an intensity that they'd lose a cumulative 31.5 pounds before returning home, and they jerry-rigged a separate mechanism to store the excess carbon dioxide they exhaled and couldn't otherwise filter out. With the immediate problems dealt with, the lunar module made slight but extremely precise calculations to slingshot itself around the far side of the moon, a process that had to be quickly worked out by mathematicians on the ground in what was basically an unplanned maneuver. By some great triumph of mathematical reasoning, the crew avoided smashing into the moon and positioned their module into just the right orientation to make their trip home. With the cabin temperature dropping to just above freezing and food and water running towards nil, the crew was able to get close to Earth, clambering back up to the command module and managing not to short-circuit the thing despite the buildup of water droplets. The crew shared their service module and the lunar module, and breathing what must have been an incredible sigh of relief, whipped by what was basically rain inside the command module because of all the water condensation, they touched down in the Pacific Ocean. The crisis immediately tunes the world back into the Apollo program after the novelty of Apollo 11 had somewhat worn off, and it had been observed in real time by well over 1 billion people. The coverage it received would eclipse that of even Apollo 11, and it was immortalized in radio and television programs, and of course, by Ron Howard's film Apollo 13. As astronaut Jim Lovell put it, "Nobody believes me, but during the 6-day odyssey, we had no idea what an impression Apollo 13 made on the people of Earth. We never dreamed 1 billion people were following us on television and radio and reading about us in banner headlines of every newspaper published." One thing the 3 astronauts never dreamed of again, at least not positively, was the idea of returning to space. At NASA, the incident would prompt yet more redesigns to future flights and led many inside the program to wonder whether it might actually be inevitable that if the Apollo program went on long enough, people really would be killed. The Apollo 13 crisis didn't end the Apollo program, but it did change things. A program that started off its missions with the devastation of the Apollo 1 flight had since been taken over by starry-eyed optimism, and then even a sort of happy ignorance from the global public at a moon exploration program that appeared to be chugging along quite nicely. But Apollo 13 had reignited that other element of mortal fear, the uncomfortable understanding that this really was dangerous work, and although NASA still had plenty more missions queued up, questions began to arise more frequently about just what the program's long-term future would be. A total of 4 more Apollo missions would blast off from Earth, all successfully landing on the moon. Apollo 14, commanded by Alan Shepard, had to overcome significant malfunctions that could have produced another crisis and doomed the program entirely, although those crises were ultimately averted. Apollo 14 explored the lunar highlands, collected nearly 100 pounds of moon rocks in the geologically rich Fra Mauro Formation, and transported several hundred seeds into orbit, which would later be grown into the so-called moon trees and spread across the world. Apollo 15 used a specially made rover to better explore the lunar surface and travel further from the module, while the astronaut left behind in the command module would perform humanity's first spacewalk in deep space. But the mission would be marred by controversy when the world learned that the astronauts aboard had brought several hundred unauthorized postal covers, which would later be sold at high prices. Apollo 16 would pass without controversy, but not without problems. At one point, an issue with their spacecraft's main engine, nearly forcing NASA to abort the mission entirely and cut the visit 1 day short in an attempt to insulate against another major crisis. This time, the crew spent just under 3 days on the lunar surface, driving their lunar rover some 16.5 miles and collecting 211 pounds of moon rocks, including Big Mully, the largest rock collected by the Apollo missions. Finally, Apollo 17 would take NASA's first professional geologist to the lunar surface, while also running biological experimentation on a few lucky mice who joined the crew on a mission that must have been exceptionally confusing for them.
This mission recovered volcanic soil from the lunar surface and smashed the record for duration: 12 days, 14 hours, and a sample return weight of 254 pounds.
Yet again, the crew were able to come home safely, splashing down just 4 miles away from the recovery ship that was dispatched to pick them up. But Apollo 17 would be man's last mission to the moon, at least within the confines of the Apollo program, and to date, it was the last time that any person has ever set foot on the lunar surface. Several more trips were planned and numbered Apollos 18, 19, and 20, but they were never planned in great enough detail to really know what they might have been. In fact, the Apollo program had been beleaguered by calls for its cancellation for years before Apollo 17. NASA's budget had started shrinking soon after Apollo 11, and by 1971, all 3 of the scheduled landings that didn't take place had already been cancelled. Richard Nixon wanted to cancel even Apollo 16 and 17, although NASA was able to convince him to stick with the 2 budgeted and planned expeditions. By the time Apollo 17 launched, the people on board understood that it would be NASA's final manned trip to the moon, or at least final for a very long time. As cool as it might have been to keep exploring the moon ad infinitum, the program had lost its appeal to the American taxpayer long before the Apollo flights actually concluded. The Apollo program had always been about the space race, at least in the American public's consciousness, and according to that same public consciousness, the space race had been won conclusively when an American flag was planted on that lunar surface. After that, the cost of the program was simply seen as too high to justify continued exploration to do work that most people didn't really care about. Sure, it was cool to learn about moon rocks for about 5 minutes, but from an aesthetic perspective, the scientific value of Apollo was about as easy to sell as an all-expense-paid months-long vacation to the inside of a broom closet. The Vietnam War was guzzling funds at an unprecedented rate, America's cities faced numerous crises, and the environment here on Earth wasn't doing great either. In all, the program cost some $25 billion at the time, cost adjusted to over $250 billion today. When it began, space enthusiasts had hoped that Apollo would kick off a golden age of exploration, from moon bases to space stations to Mars explorations and more. But in the end, it had the opposite effect. The public had been hungry for a trip to the moon, and they'd gotten a trip to the moon, and their hunger had been satisfied. They had also seen the risk of death and grievous bodily harm to the people brave enough to venture out on these missions. And for a country that was already seeing too many young men die halfway around the world, sending more up to die at space simply wasn't reasonable. Subsequent experiments by NASA, including the Skylab program and the Apollo-Soyuz program, would turn into a slow, quiet end to the space race itself, and NASA traded off much of its expected Apollo funding in order to secure what it needed for the Space Shuttle program. In Washington, Apollo had turned into a political liability, and then, as now, that was all most politicians needed to know in order to figure out where they stood on its future. Apollo was done, and it wouldn't be coming back. But what legacy the Apollo program did enjoy on Earth was more than simply a facet of its space race victory. The technologies and inventions that came from Apollo have since permeated many elements of human life, yielding gadgetry and tech that might otherwise have taken decades more to develop. Thermal blankets, vacuum-sealed food, fireproof firefighting uniforms, and modern insulin pumps all trace their history to the Apollo program, as do optical technologies like LASIK and scratch-resistant lenses. The missions set off advancements in photovoltaic cell technology, tire composition, and even mattress construction, where the couches on board the Apollo missions would eventually bring us memory foam. Cameras got a whole lot better with the Apollo program's demands, so much so that the modern GoPro, the cell phone camera, and the digital handheld all owe their genesis to America's mission to the moon. Athletic shoes, LED lights, 3D food printing, the computer mouse, and the fly-by-wire systems used on modern aircraft all got their start with Apollo. Even the humble Dustbuster, the handheld vacuum, traces its motor to a Black & Decker built for the Apollo 11 landing. And the explorer spirit that the Apollo program might not have cultivated in real life was nonetheless given a massive boost in media as a result of the program. Apollo was absolutely a cultural turning point. It was a series of moments that unbelievably large proportions of the world population experienced together, and it was a catalyst for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people to dedicate their lives to the study of science and engineering. In fact, if there's any single legacy from Apollo that stands above the rest, it's that. The people who took Apollo as their reason to start applying their own minds towards exploration, innovation, and discovery, and who now form the bedrock not just of NASA, but of the world's scientific ambition. So, while we're on the topic of scientific ambition, there's one more subject that we've got to touch on before the Apollo program's story can really be brought to a close. And that's the next moon missions, and specifically the Apollo successor program that is Artemis. And by 2025, it endeavors to carry on the same mission that will have concluded a full 50 years earlier, to walk across the lunar surface yet again. Now, Artemis is one of those programs that we're probably going to discuss again, but it bears special exploration when compared to the Apollo missions that came before. NASA has had half a century to learn from both the successes and failures of the Apollo program, as well as to reap the rewards of continued exploration of our cosmos and some game-changing technological development here on Earth. This time, NASA will be making a focused, steady, and entirely intentional march towards safe, sustainable moon landings, and they're not going it alone. In the 21st century, NASA is partnering with private organizations like SpaceX and Blue Origin, as well as its international partners, Germany, Japan, Canada, Israel, Italy, and the European Union, alongside a number of other countries bound together in a pact known as the Artemis Accords. As of now, Artemis 1 has already concluded its first mission. An uncrewed test, Artemis 1, featured the launch of the Orion spacecraft, an analog to the Apollo program spacecraft with its own crew and service modules. When launched, the Orion spacecraft in Artemis 1 successfully completed a flyby of the moon, released several satellites, made a second flyby, and then crashed down to Earth to demonstrate the reliability of its heat shield. Safe to say, the mission was a success, and the readouts on 3 astronaut-like mannequins inside, loaded up with sensors, indicated that the cabin environment was just as NASA had hoped. But Artemis 1 is just the start. At the time of writing, the launch of Artemis 2 is barely just a year away, in a crewed spaceflight that will perform a close flyby of the moon. The crew module will carry a team of 4, Reed Reisman, Victor Glover, and Christina Koch from the US, and Jeremy Hansen of Canada. Together, they'll perform a mission of up to 21 days in a much more technologically advanced encore of the feats performed by the Apollo 8 astronauts in 1968. Unlike that mission, Artemis 2 will not be placed into lunar orbit, but they don't necessarily need to be. The equipment intended to be on board has become so sophisticated that even a single flyby will yield some incredible amounts of data. And then it'll be time for Artemis 3, the big one. Currently planned for December of 2025, Artemis 3 will take a team of 4 as-yet unnamed astronauts to the moon aboard an Orion spacecraft, 2 of whom will then transition to a lander known as Starship HLS. Starship will bring those 2 astronauts to the lunar surface, where they'll perform multiple space rocks, sample water ice, and carry out scientific experimentation all on the moon's south pole. Unlike Apollo 11, they'll find equipment already waiting for them, including multiple caches of supplies and an unpressurized rover that can be ridden around or controlled remotely. They may also rendezvous with the Lunar Gateway, a planned space station that would be humanity's first in an extraterrestrial environment. Placed into lunar orbit and powered with solar panels, the Lunar Gateway is expected to be 1 part communications relay, 1 part laboratory, and 1 part short-stay motel for the astronauts of the world. It's expected to hit lunar orbit about a month before Artemis 3 arrives and serve as a staging point not just for that mission, but for future robotic and crewed exploration as well. After Artemis 3, it'll be off to the races with future plans to make more lunar landings, resupply the Lunar Gateway using Falcon Heavy rockets, and work in concert with the Viper rover, which is expected to land on the moon's South Pole region in November of 2024 to explore permanently shadowed craters and look for water ice. 18 American astronauts now train full-time for the upcoming Artemis missions, with the rest of NASA's 42 members of the astronaut corps eligible to join them. And with luck, the Artemis mission will lead to the Artemis Base Camp, a lunar base expected to be set up near the end of the 2020s. The inhabitants there will get a service habitat where they can live and work, a pressurized rover that can take them across long distances for up to 2 weeks at a time, and constant resupplies for autonomous support ships that can, at this point, show up on time with highly dependable regularity. At present, 6 total Artemis missions have already been scheduled, with another 5 currently in discussions all the way out to Artemis 11. And while Artemis might be leading the way for lunar exploration, there are a number of other nations trying to follow in the Apollo program's legacy too. India hopes to expand its growing lunar exploration program. Russia and China have claimed that they'll collaborate in order to establish a joint lunar base. And the private company SpaceX hopes to eventually get its Starship, a super heavy lift launch vehicle with the potential to take 100 people or more into space, into a shape where it would be ready to carry paying customers around the moon too. From the moon, the hope is that the nations of the world someday might bridge the gap to Mars, and from there, it's impossible to say. But all of this, from the Artemis program to the broader work done by the NASA programs of today to the global mission to try and reach the moon yet again, exists in the warm afterglow of the mission that came before it. Today, it's as clear as ever that the Apollo program was a truly historic venture, a mad dash to break boundaries that had seemed all but impenetrable less than a decade before Apollo smashed through them. It's quite possibly the most pivotal space exploration program of all time. It's among the most remarkable things that human beings have ever done, and it leaves a legacy that has kept humanity gazing upward into the cosmos for all the decades that followed, and for the many decades yet to come.